Hey guys, Kirby Kid here. We're back with another episode of Design Over Time, and this time we are going to take a look at a bunch of fighting games. In the last episode, we really went by in a really detailed way to understand exactly what the core elements are that make up fighting game gameplay. Now, this really has less to do with what people label as the genre conventions and more to do with what exact game rules need to be in place in order to get the fighting game gameplay, the distinct fighting game experience to emerge out of those rules from gameplay. So, we went over a 4-part criteria, and from there, now it's time to use it, right? We got to look at a lot of different examples. You can see here down at the bottom of the screen, fighting games are really just a type of action game, and action games are games that feature, typically continuous space, continuous time, and they stress, all the various skills that we have because they're real time. But then you have brawler games, which these games feature, articulated hitboxes and hurtboxes because they feature some kind of melee combat, punches and kicks and things like that. And they're also typically single player or co-op. But there's a whole level beyond brawler, which, we're calling fighting games right here. And you take a lot of the same stuff that makes up an action game, you build on it. You take the same stuff that makes up a brawler, you build on it. And from that point, you have to start tuning, balancing, and refining your game around double blind interplay. And that basically means, there are distinct advantages and disadvantages that you get when you can appropriately time your moves at the same time your opponent does. So when both of you are blind to what each other are doing and in a position where neither of you can react, there are certain opportunities and advantages you can get by guessing right, by predicting correctly, by timing your moves precisely. So we're going to look at exactly how that plays out a little bit by looking at a whole bunch of different examples. But the main purpose of this video is to really look at the diversity of fighting games. And I'll click over to the screen to show you what I mean. So there are a bunch of different types of fighting games, and there are a lot of different ways that fighters differentiate themselves. So in addition to creating a balance centered around melee attacks with double blind interplay, a fighting game can create unique movement, characters, defensive options, offensive options, combos, controls, additional rules, etc. So we're going to take a look at a few categories just to see the diversity and the range of different fighting games, and hopefully I'll be able to show you some video of this stuff happening in action. So our first category is offense, right? And typically when people think of fighting games, they think of combos because combos are a pretty cool way to chain one attack into another. And there are lots of games out there that are pretty heavy on the combos. I mean, lots of fighting games do have combos, but there are some where the combos last quite a long time. I mean, in excess of 5 seconds, 10 seconds or whatever, you can pretty much zero to death characters if you're skilled and talented enough. The Marvel vs. Capcom series is particularly known for this. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom is another heavy combo heavy game. You have games like Skullgirls and Persona, the Persona fighter, other anime fighters like Guilty Gear, and I even threw Melee in this category. And for a platform fighter like Smash Brothers, Melee is definitely more on the combo side. I would also throw in Smash 64. Smash Melee. So both of those games, compared to Brawl and compared to Smash 4, are much heavier on the combo side. And even games like Tekken, where you're juggling people across the stage with multiple hits and even hitting them off the ground or against walls and stuff like that for additional hits and combos. But let's take a look at what some of these look like. So this is Marvel vs. Capcom 3 from EVO Grand Finals with Chris G versus Kane Blue River. So we're going to turn this down a little bit. This might actually be a really good example of projectile zoning. So you can see the Hulk on the left side actually blocking a ton of different projectiles from Morgan, who is firing a pretty annoying, pretty sort of polarizing setup with these double projectiles after using, I think, what it's called astro projection and doubling her offense. But as you can see here, here's an example of a combo going. And we're at 26 hits, 28 hits, it still keeps going. This is all pretty typical and normal. That was a very special sort of reversal situation, which stopped the combo early, if you can even imagine that. But Marvel vs. Capcom, definitely one of those games that features tons of long combo strings. So this is EVO 2010, K-Beast versus Marn. So yeah, this game came out on the Wii. You can tell it's a little bit low resolution, but hopefully we'll be able to see exactly what we're looking for here, long combos. Oh, that was a 14 hit combo. Let's see what happens here. Cross under starts a combo. We're at 10 hits. We're at 14 hits. It looks like he did some kind of a combo extension move. I forgot what they're called in this game. So in this game, they feature certain kind of bursts to get themselves out of combos, and that's something that's kind of common and popular in these kinds of combo-heavy games. Like, sure, combos are fun, but nobody wants to be in a combo for so long, so they give you these really risky but effective opportunities to burst out of the combo. Have to sacrifice some meter or some kind of other opportunity, and if your opponent guesses right, they can keep you in the combo, but if they don't, you can get out of a very dangerous situation. So there's another burst, I think. Okay, cool. Sonic Fox. So this is the NEC 16 Skullgirls Grand Finals featuring Sonic Fox and Day Kill Sage. I'm not familiar with that player, but I do know Sonic Fox. Everyone should know Sonic Fox. So here we go. So Skullgirls is a kind of a unique game. We'll talk a little bit more about its tag team features in a bit. But we're really looking for some heavy combos, right? So we're at 5 hits, 8 hits. Reset the combo. So that was a 13-hit combo. And as you can see, these strings are going for quite a long time.
Yeah, they're just playing solo right now. Oh, no, there's an assist. Alright.
So, you know, I think that combo had 2 resets in it, but it pretty much went from 0 to death with a lot of control on the attacking player. So this is kind of what you should typically expect from combo-heavy fighters. It kind of sucks to be in a combo, but when you get it on your opponent, you know, you need to press that advantage as far as it goes. Let's see how long this combo goes before switching off. Okay, there we go. So yeah, that's pretty much how combos go for a lot of combo-heavy games. So back on the list, while we are still considering offense, there's a different style that, if you're not a big fan of combos, I'm not too big of a fan of combos, so all the fighting games that I really put a lot of time into do not feature the kinds of long combos that you just saw in that video. But there's the sort of opposite style. It's not exactly like 100% opposite of combo heavy style, but typically when a game is combo heavy, it doesn't feature footsies, and typically when a game it really focuses on footsies, there are not a lot of long combos. Footsies is a style of sort of hand-to-hand combat, melee combat, in which typically emerges when you have short combos, really short hit stun opportunities, so your combos are only like 1-2 hits, and then, you know, you get back to neutral or something close to neutral, so both players have an opportunity to get back into the action. And there's a very low amount of block stun. So in these games, you're not just going to lock your opponent down with attacks, and all they can do is block and look for a tiny hole. In these games, there's holes everywhere, and it's up to you to figure out when those holes open and close, when to throw out your own attacks, and how to negotiate the space in between you and your opponent at relatively close range by using your attacks. So there's a lot more to explain about footsies, but I kind of want to show you exactly what it looks like, because seeing it is a lot more effective than me explaining it sometimes. But not all the time, sometimes. This is Street Fighter Third Strike. Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, as it's called. And this is a really heavily footsies fighter, so you can see both players sort of exchanging tiny blows, trying to negotiate tiny bits of space, and the combos are really about 3 hits for the most part. So you're going to see less rushing in, you're going to see less jumping around, you're going to see a lot of this, what we call footsies, you know, ground-based, tight negotiation of micro spacing and trying to catch limbs out in midair, trying to whiff punish and do all these interesting things. And that was a super, so the combo count's going to be pretty high for that one. But yeah, this game looks very different from Tatsunoko. It looks very different from Achievement Unlocked. It looks very different from Skullgirls, in which you saw a lot of pressure coming in, but this game is a lot cleaner. It's a lot more of what you would kind of see in a martial arts film. Characters just going at it, barely dodging each other, crouching, getting in each other's faces. This is a lot more sort of intuitive for a lot of people when they're watching this. So yeah, pokes. Pokes are really strong in footsies-oriented games. I'm going to show a couple more examples before moving on. Let's look at, let's see, Street Fighter, Wii Sports Boxing, Virtual. So let's look at some King of Fighters and Virtual Fighter. Juicebox being my favorite KOF player, because he's the only one I know, but also because he does really good tutorial videos on his stream, and he talks about how the game works. So if you ever want to learn, because that's how you do well at these games, listening to people like Juicebox is really important. Alright, so Juicebox is on the right. He's playing this character named King. I don't know too much about this series, but essentially we're going to see a lot of the same things we saw in Third Strike. The characters kind of whiffing moves out in front of each other, taking small steps backwards. Unlike Street Fighter, where their small steps look like inches, in this game they take hops forward, hops backwards, and tiny little jumps. It's functionally the same thing, even though it doesn't look as sort of in your face and as tight as Street Fighter, but they are still playing footsies. They're trying to whiff punish each other. They're trying to very carefully predict and maneuver around each other's attacks as they're being used in real time in true double blind fashion. So that's a really cool thing that I really love about fighting games, but it's a really cool thing to pay attention to. In case you want to know the title, KOF 14 EVO 2016. So this is just footage from last summer. So yeah, you can see here one hits, throwing a few projectiles, trying to bait each other to overcommit by dashing forward when, you know, it's a bad time to dash forward and punishing them for it. Dragon Ball Z moments. But you can see this kind of gameplay looks very different than what we saw in Marvel vs. Capcom and the other combo heavy games. And I'm going to show some Virtual Fighter. So Reinhardt on the left, Fudo on the right. Both of these are Street Fighter players as well, but I think they got their start in Virtual Fighter, at least Fudo did. But just like with Third Strike, you can kind of see that the combos don't last very long. The interactions, there's not long strings of attacks, but tiny holes, and you can see both players trying to poke and use specific moves inside of those tiny holes to get the advantage, for better and for worse. Sometimes you trap yourself, you hang yourself by trying to bite early, and sometimes it's better to just swing away. Because this is a 3D fighter, you know, you can't see the negotiation of space as easily. It's not back and forth, it's back and forth and left and right and around. But the same basic idea applies. They're very carefully negotiating the space between themselves, trying to catch each other when their moves are active in a way that gives them the advantage. The block strings aren't long, the combos aren't long, and they're both in it. And it's quite intense. So movement. Let's talk about movement real quick. So there's a whole category of fighters that people either call air dash fighters or burst fighters or anime fighters, but it's a specific style of fighter that gives players the ability to either air dash or dash forward at high speeds to close in the distance between themselves and the opponent. And typically in these games you'll see a lot of dashing instead of walking. You'll see a lot of air maneuverability and double jumping and stuff like that. So let's take a look at a few. Let's look at Guilty Gear. Okay, cool. We have a video here featuring Marlon Pai. He's one of my favorite Street Fighter players, and we are going to skip straight into the beginning of the match right here. Okay, so you can see here both players jumping in the air and dashing forward, air dashing. You know, right there he tried to air dash and got clipped. There's normal jumps, of course, but typically you're going to see a lot of air dashing. And air dash back, air dash forward to try to get out of the corner. This is just highlighting the unique kind of movement that you see. So even though it looks like Street Fighter in that it's 2D and both characters are squaring off, you can see a lot more burst-like attacks and a lot more air dashing and double jumping, if you will. And if you couldn't tell before, this game is a long combo game. So that was an 18-hit combo, pretty much wiped out half of Marlon Pai's life. Yeah. And you can see juggles like this happening. There's a burst, so just because it's a combo heavy game, you see a lot of options like that. Burst, we talked about that previously. That's cool. Let's look at Persona. So this is the final round that Bananakin. So Bananakin is on a match point, right? So if he wins this, he wins. But you can see a lot of double jumping out of pressure, out of the hit stun a little bit. You can see some air dashing already. You can see long combo strings and dashing in. Just a lot of attacking offensive pressure, right? Very different from what you see in the Footsies oriented games with the lack of block pressure and the lack of offense. You see less pokes in this case. You see more pressure.
my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Is this gonna happen? Oh my goodness. It's gonna happen. Oh my goodness. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh god. Oh! It's a tournament winner.
So, along with air dashing and ground dashing and things like that, or KOFs, even hyper hopping and various forms of jumping in, there's a subgenre, you know, a type of movement, a type of game that you see here called platform fighter, and this is very much Smash Bros. Style. There we go. Yeah, so platform fighters. You have Smash Bros. You have games like Bar Ball. You have Jump Superstars. You have Dragblade. You have Needhog. And these are games where, unlike in Street Fighter, unlike in Persona, unlike just about every other fighting game, these games give you full control of your movement. So it doesn't matter which side your opponent's on. You can run left, right, and jump around as you please. And they built their fighting gameplay around that. So I'm going to show some footage, because we always talk about Smash Bros. And we'll do that later. But I want to show some footage of Jump Superstars and Needhog and maybe Bar Ball. So this is a video by IGN, Jump Superstars Nintendo DS gameplay. But as you can see, you play your little characters, and Goku here can just like attack wherever he wants. He can jump up on those platforms and kind of leave the area to try to get items. You know, there's right here, Goku's gonna go up, and there's plenty of space to explore and hit items at your opponents and maybe get some treasure chests. So, you know, definitely free to do whatever you want and go wherever you want. There's things that pressure you, and like the corners do in traditional fighters. In this game, you can, you know, bust through the papery walls of these manga worlds, and then if you get knocked outside of this book that you're fighting in, you die. So, ring outs just like Smash Brothers, pretty interesting there. Okay, so this is Needhog Tournament by this YouTube channel. So as you can see, 1v1 players squaring off, and every time you get a kill, you run forward. You're trying to make it completely to the end of your level. You spawn with a sword every time, and it's one-hit kills. So you can kind of see what that looks like. And there's pits, so you can run forward and backwards, you can jump around, you can grab things. Your movement is not in any way affected by where your opponent is to the left or right of you. But whoever has the advantage does get the camera control, so you have to take out your opponents directly in order to get any headway. That's Needhog. Very cool. Okay, going back. Yeah, and there's other games. I can show Bar Ball briefly. Hey, look, it's me on a stream.
A lot of this game should be very familiar to Smash Brothers and Sisters.
So let me.
Expert. He almost
No talking, Richard. So yeah, as you can see here in Bar Ball, you are fighting over a ball, and you're supposed to get it dunked on the your colored water, right? And you have the freedom to use any of your 7 jumps in midair. Those are indicated by those jump orbs, those dots around your character. You can go down into the water, up around the stage, underneath the stage, complete freedom of movement. So there's a whole genre of fighting games that specialize in freedom of movement, and typically when you have freedom of movement, they give you some platforms or something to jump on, so that's why we call them platform fighters. Here's a type of fighter called tag team based. Sometimes in fighting games they give you multiple characters that you can play on your team. So in order to switch between them, you tag them in and out, and then they fly in and do something. Sometimes they are assist types, like as you see here in the second list. Sometimes you actually switch and take control of another character. Sometimes it's both, like in Marvel vs. Capcom, you see here. So Skullgirls here, we're returning to the footage we were looking at earlier. This is a grand finals match, but as you can see at the top, there's 3 life bars on the left and there's 2 life bars on the right because the player on the right already lost a character. But in this game, you are challenged to use 1 to 3 characters in order to beat your opponent's 1 to 3 characters. The less characters you have, the more health they have and the more damage they do. So you can leverage, you know, specializing in 1 character, or you can go for diversity and specialize in multiple by having 3 per team. And as you can see here, you can switch them in and out, or just take them out in different orders, right? So this is the left player's last character. And depending on how weak your character is that's fighting in the match, you might want to switch them out so they can gain some health. There's different strategies and different reasons why you would switch out your characters. So you can see both players are calling in their you know, characters hanging out on the sidelines by calling in these assists. So whenever you see more than one character on the screen, that's because a player activated that assist type, and they are using that layered offense in order to put even more pressure on their opponents. Because obviously when your attack ends, if you can have one of your allies jump in and throw out some attacks, that's just better for you. And that's the basic idea you see here. So we have one character here on the screen, switches out to another character, uses a super, finishes off the white character, and then switches back to the character that was on the screen in the first place. So there's a lot of switching, there's a lot of things you have to keep up with, there's a lot of characters you have to learn, but that's just one particular style of fighting game. You can see more of that in Marvel vs. Capcom. The match opens up with Morgan and Hulk. The user assist types at the same time. There's 4 characters on the screen, lots of explosions. It's possible to hit the characters that are popping in from the side of the screen. Morgan does a team hyper combo and gets in Dr. Doom, and Dr. Doom continues to combo Hulk. Does a team combo, what is it called? Team Aerial Rave? Team hyper combo, THC. And then switches out the characters. So you can see a lot of characters switching in and out, and you have to utilize your whole team, and there's pros and cons to having characters in and out at different times, but that is the nature of these kinds of games. So yeah, Marvel vs. Capcom, Tekken Tag, obviously in the name, you tag in and out your allies. Skullgirls, Marvel vs. Capcom, you can call in assist types and jump superstars as well as switch characters. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, I think it has assist types as well. That's kind of a weird fighting game. Pokken, I want to show some Pokken. So yeah, Canada Cup 2016 reverse, playing Suicune versus 1UP Thrillho versus it's a Braxian player.
Oh, I didn't even see that. Wow.
Fire versus water. So as you can see here, it's mostly a 1v1 fighter. You pick your one character you want to go in, but you do have the choice of using these assist types. You can see on the left side of the screen the tiny Sylveon, and on the right side of the screen you have this Emolga assist type ready. And they do different things like buff you, debuff your opponent. There's an assist right there, using an attack to anti-air Suicune. So sometimes they attack, sometimes they heal you, sometimes they buff you, sometimes whatever, some combination. So this game, you fight normally, and then you use your assist types at very key moments in order to break up the flow and expand your strategies. Good old Pokken Tournament. And Dragblade, that's a game for DS. Crazy game, kind of like Jump Superstars, with touchscreen controls and customizable decks, if you will. So let's consider space real quick. Pokken is actually a perfect example to talk about space. There's 2 huge categories for space when you're talking about fighters. You're talking about 3D fighters, you're talking about 2D fighters. Most of the fighters are 2D, so I didn't really bother making a category for that. But Soul Calibur, Tekken, Virtua Fighter, Pokken Tournament is a hybrid between 2D and 3D. And games like Bushido Blade, they are 3D fighters. So you can see here, Pokken switches back and forth between 3D and 2D. So right now this is, oh, that was perfect. So it starts off in 3D. The characters can just run around in all 8 directions. They call that 8-way run. As soon as certain conditions are fulfilled, like grabs or whatever, it can go into a 2D setup. And here's your 2D setup where the characters cannot dance around each other. They can't sidestep. They have to go forward and back, like more traditional Street Fighter-like gameplay. So very interesting. For a 3D fighter, I think this game has some of the most free movement I've ever seen. In Tekken and Virtua Fighter, you're pretty much locked onto your opponent like in a Zelda game. But in this game, in a 3D mode like this, you can just run in any direction, forward, back, any direction. You can jump, you can do air attacks or whatever, and it's pretty open in that regard. So kind of taking a little bit of inspiration, a little hint from the platform fighters with their freedom of movement and doing cool stuff like that. So that's Pokken. Do I have any Virtual Fighters up? Yeah, right here. Going back to Virtual Fighter, you can see that the characters are just locked into each other. I need to get... So yeah, like, you can sidestep a little bit, but that's more like a move instead of just... it's like a dodge instead of movement. And you're not free to sort of just completely run around how you like. So yeah, most games are 2D, very few are 3D, some are hybrids like Pokken, that's super, super rare. But then there's other weird things that games can do. Like I want to showcase Bleach for DS. It's a fighter I played for a very little bit, but essentially this game allows you to play 4 players, but instead of, you know, squishing everybody on the same small screen, they have lanes, and there's 1 lane in the back, 1 lane in the front, and 2 players each. I think you can jump back and forth to make it more than 2, but I'm not too sure about the rules. As you can see, the shaded characters are the ones in the back. They're fighting independently and moving independently of the players in the front, and I think you can do assists to help out your teammate. A really clever idea, really unique. I have no idea how well it works, but for a DS game, trying some cool new things, definitely worth studying. Okay, so there are different ways games do health. This whole series talked about cumulative damage with Smash Bros. As an alternative way to do health, and how dynamic and how different that makes Smash Brothers on a core fundamental level. But we can see here that there are some other options for fighters. I call these just deadly fighters. It's just a phrase I randomly made up. But essentially, some fighters have really, really quick rounds, right? Where there's essentially one-hit kills. So we saw Needhog before. Where is that? One hit, whether you choke them, throw your sword, whether you get stabbed or whatever, or fall down a pit. One hit is all it takes to, turn the tides right there. But there's other games like Dive Kick, Bushido Blade. I think it ends rather quickly for a fighting game, but we're going to look at Senior Footsies and Dive Kick as our next 2 examples. Esam is a Smash player. Shoutouts to Smash Brothers. So as you can see here, Dive Kick is a game where you only have a dive kick and one-hit kills. There are headshots which kind of make the next round your opponent gets dizzy, which makes it harder for them to survive. But for the most part, that's irrelevant. We're talking about the health system. In this game, it's a one-hit KO system. And you have 5 rounds, 5 rounds per game, and best 2 out of 3 games per match. But each round goes by awfully quickly. I mean, even while I was talking, I think 2 happened. And you can see the timer for the match is very low as well. Let's take a look at Senior Footsies. Okay, so this is Senior Footsies. It's kind of like Dive Kick, where they made an entire sort of fighting game around very particular aspect of fighting, which is footsies. And as I described before, footsies is trying to play in close quarters combat and whiff punish your opponent, trying to predict exactly when their attacks are going to be sticking out in front of you and how to counterattack it. Footsies is not about jumping around. It's not about crazy movement. It's not about oppressive offensive pressure. It's not about block strings. It's all about negotiating the space with your attacks, using attacks to negotiate between you and your opponent. So this is a game where all you have is like a low sweep, which is a strong low sweeping attack that has more range than your low medium, your low poke. And you can see both attacks being exhibited here. That's the fast one. That's the fast one. That's the slow one. It's got a little bit more range and maybe more priority. I don't know. But essentially both these players are just trying to get the single hit advantage on each other. So when we're talking about minimum things you need to make a fighting game happen, I think it doesn't get any more minimal than Senior Footsies, perhaps. Forward, back, kick, and then you have a meter to get to shoot a gun, just to break up a little bit of the monotony, just to give you to give the offensive attacking player a little bit more of an advantage. So you build meter by whiffing moves, and the low sweep, the heavy one, gives you more meter, but it's easier for your opponent to react to. So you have to just play precisely inside of that risk reward, saying how much time and what can I get away with and what kind of advantages am I going to go for right here. Right, that was excellent. So cool. Senior Footsies. Another thing games can do, fighting games have commonly done, is to alter their controls. And people have complained for years that fighting games have too complicated of controls and they can't learn combos or whatever. And for the most part, a lot of that is just excuse making. There's a lot of characters in each of these games that are much simpler to execute than others, and ultimately you can do extremely well in a fighting game just by learning your fundamentals, just basic spacing, basic emotional states that you can put your opponent into and how to capitalize on it. And it has less to do with combos and more to do with your overall philosophy on how to fight. But regardless, a lot of games have done interesting things to simplify the controls of their game in order to make that barrier or that excuse not even a problem, taking that excuse completely off the table. Smash Brothers is obviously the most popular game in this style, simplifying the controls to just one button in one direction and letting you move around much like you do in a platformer game. Dive kick has 2 buttons for the entire game. Now, in some ways, that makes the game a little bit more complicated because you have to hit one button for one thing, one for another. You tap both for something, and then, you know, there's other commands for special characters. But for the most part, few buttons, few commands, relatively simple game. Rising Thunder was a game that was being developed by Seth Killian and other designers, trying to simplify fighting gameplay inputs by just making everything single button and just giving you cooldowns in order to counterbalance the fact that everybody can throw out special moves a little easier. I'm going to show some Rising Thunder. So this is the Rising Thunder game. Each of the specials are activated by just one button. KO. This video was uploaded by Marcos Wet, it looks like, in case you were curious. So very much a Street Fighter-like game, but the inputs are very simple. And as you can see, every time a special is used on, by the big robot, every time a special is used, you can see the cooldown happening right there. So, you know, 2 point whatever seconds until he can use that missile again, 2.8, I think. And they're negotiating the space and understanding the time, the fact that everything takes time, and every time is a resource, more so than it is with other fighters where you can just throw out as fireballs as soon as the other one is off the screen. So as you can see here, this is Sir Lin's fighting game. The inputs are simplified. The health bar is simplified, so instead of a continuous health bar, you see chunks, and everything takes at least one chunk. That makes these 2 characters have a lot of health. So, you know, that match even, you saw more hits than you typically would see in this game. So here's Valerie. She has less health, as you can see. You can count it. It's 5. So now almost half of her health is gone by one command grab. That's 2. So you can tell the match is almost over. This is something of a unique take on health, but it's really just clarifying and simplifying a lot of the things that fighting games are already doing. So that's cool too. And then in general, I want to say that fighting games can mix in other types of gameplay and still be fighting games. I mean, honestly, the definition that I propose, the criteria, focuses on hand-to-hand melee combat. But that doesn't mean that every single interaction and every single thing that happens in the game has to be hand-to-hand melee combat. It just means that hand-to-hand melee combat needs to be balanced to be the most important thing and the most advantageous thing that leads into the biggest advantages in most cases, right? So Street Fighter has projectile zoning, and when you're throwing projectiles in Street Fighter, you are not engaging in hand-to-hand combat. You are actually trying to keep your opponent back from across the screen, and you don't really care if they die across the screen because that's just the nature of the game. So in those moments, you're really not engaging so much in a fighting game as you're engaging in a much more relatively simple projectile-based action game. But as soon as they close in, you know, fighting game and those close quarters moves, those are the things that matter. So let me show you an example. So yeah, Sagat has a really sort of deadly fireball game, and as you can see here, it's just throwing them, and it's really hard for the opponent to get around. And even if you know the timing, you may not be able to do it well because Sagat can mix up the speed of his fireballs. And now it's back into a close quarters game, but Sagat, all he needs to do is get back into the backing away from his opponent and then resume. That gives Sagat a lot of offensive power. So this is exactly what we're talking about when we're saying fighting games can mix in action, verbs, mechanics, even rules, even from other games, as long as that they don't disrupt the balance too much. So, you know, there are opinions, there are things to be said about the effectiveness of the strategy that you're seeing here. And in later iterations of Street Fighter, the power of fireballs has definitely gone down. But this is just a really extreme but clear example of how effective projectile zoning and fireballs can be in a game like Street Fighter. Let's see what else happens in this match. So yeah, when the 2 players are up close, they have to use their melee attacks. So it's a very different landscape. But as soon as Sagat gets a little bit of distance, he can revert to the zoning game. And then there's pros and cons every time he throws a fireball. So the game is still very much balanced around double blind, but it doesn't look the same as a fighter, and there's other dynamics, there's other strategies that are being stressed more than what you typically find if the game were just melee attacks and hand-to-hand moves. So yeah, projectile zoning, Smash Bros. Brawl and Wii U are much better about projectiles than Smash 64 and even Melee. Some of the best characters in Melee have pretty good projectiles, but for the most part, most of the characters don't, and they're fairly unusable. And in Brawl, some of the projectiles were a little too effective, and they didn't link into the hand-to-hand melee style combat as well. So a lot of players would specialize in just a complete runaway and shoot you strategy, but Wii U I think has the perfect balance. Projectiles are pretty conservative. There was another video I made on Mario's conservative fireballs in Super Smash Bros. For Wii U. You can check that out to understand and get more details on exactly what I mean by conservative design. But overall, the fireballs, the projectiles in Smash Bros. Wii U are conservative. They're effective, but they're not something that are so good you can build your whole game plan around it, and I like that balance better. It's a much better fighting game balance in my opinion. Yeah, Marvel vs. Capcom, we saw that Morgan footage. It's right here. So Morgan and these projectiles is incredibly powerful, and she can shoot them from both sides of the screen. They do a lot of chip damage against you, and Morgan builds meter as it happens. So incredibly powerful, to say the least. Barbari Ball is a game that mixes in a ball into a fighting game, and even though you can internalize and understand a lot of the interactions in Barbari Ball with sports like terms like passing and shooting, the game is still a fighting game. You fight for the ball, you fight around the ball, and you fight to recover the ball. So it's just changing the way you think about fighting. It's the main purpose of the ball. You know, there's some games that incorporate QTEs. I think Mortal Kombat does it, or Injustice, or probably not Injustice, but there's a Mortal Kombat game where you transition from one part of the stage to the other, and as you do that, you have a small QTE that you participate in. Some games give you touchscreen collectible things, and you can customize your character, like the DS fighting games in particular. And I hear there's like a MOBA character in one of the newest Guilty Gears, but yeah, fighting games can mix and match their gameplay with a lot of other styles. A lot of people get bent out of shape when they say, oh, the genre can only, genre should be general and they should cover all these edge cases. But it's much more effective to focus in on what the core commonalities are and just recognize that fighting games and any other game is free to mix and match rules as they please. But ultimately, the balance is going to fall on one side or the other. Ultimately, the game is going to play like one thing over the other, and that's just a much more structured way, a much more effective way of understanding how these games work and how to play them better. So this is a short list I came up with. I haven't played every single game on this list, so this is just what I've been observing and talking to players and doing some research. But this is a list of games that look like fighters, but they are not fighters. PlayStation Battle Royale All-Stars is not a fighter because they did not balance the moves out in a way that is supported by double-blind interplay, right? So there's a lot of projectiles and a lot of running away in this game, and even though it's a really subtle thing to look at a game like Street Fighter, like what we just saw, and say, hey, that game looks like the projectiles are completely dominant, and then look at a game like PlayStation All-Stars and think, well, if they're dominant here too, then both of them should be a fighter. But it would take sort of looking really carefully at the frame data in order to explain what the difference is. I can show you a little bit of PlayStation. Where is it? So yeah, here we go. Iggy plays Fat Princess, and as you can see here, there's going to be a lot of projectiles happening in this match. But if there's a lack of the close quarters melee combat, the lack of effectiveness of the moves, if you can't get an advantage by predicting what your opponent's going to do, then the gameplay is pretty much going to devolve or evolve, if you will, into something like this, where both players are using a ton of projectiles. They're not directly engaging each other very often. They're both on a routine, and because there's not a lot of interplay, double-blind interplay in particular, they have a hard time of breaking each other out of that routine. So you see just a lot of movement, you see a lot of quote-unquote strategy, and of course both players are skilled and they're trying to win, but the nature of the interactions and the nature of the gameplay is very different than what you would find in a fighter. And even though you can take this kind of strategy, this kind of mindset into a lot of fighters and do well, the difference is when things get predictable, when things get when the strategies get really tight in a fighting game, your ability to predict your opponent gives you the advantage, and you can see yourself out of even the tightest situations by doing appropriate timings based on those predictions. In this game, I don't think you can do that. You have to run your offense and kind of be patient enough to outlast your opponent, and it just takes a really long time, right? I mean, there's other issues with this game that are not the subject of this video. So yeah, Final Fantasy Dissidia, I think just about every action RPG is action RPGs are so troubled anyway, but for the most part, I think action RPGs are one of the hardest hybrid genres you can do, because what makes action games good is like the exact opposite of what makes RPGs run and tick and why people like them. And when you combine them, I think they ruin each other. Even though Final Fantasy Dissidia has a 1v1 head-to-head mode, it pretty much plays like PlayStation Battle Royale All-Stars, where when both players optimize their offense, even predicting what they do 100%, there's not a lot you can do about it, which means that in a double-blind situation, your ability to know what your opponent does doesn't matter, and that means the game isn't balanced around double-blind, which means you can probably find some dominant strategies, and they did, and as far as I know, that's the highest level play for games like PlayStation Battle Royale and Final Fantasy Dissidia. Xenogears Battle Arena. Xenogears has a battle mode inside of it where you can play 1v1 and you're a mech and you're running around. Let me see if I can find that. So this old PlayStation game, it's kind of a neat surprise to see that not only did it have a interesting sort of mini game inside of it where you can battle your mechs, but then they give you the ability to do player versus computer, or even computer versus computer. So neat. And as you can see in this game, like other sort of mech fighters, you can move around, you can shoot projectiles at each other, look, melee attacks. But this game is not only very simple, but it's definitely not tuned around double-blind encounters. I mean, it doesn't really matter how complex your game is, how many moves it has, or how many characters or stages or whatever. You can get a really interesting game out of a very few complexities, kind of like Senior Footsies or Dive Kick even. But in this case, like, there is no balance with regards to double-blind. So even though it has melee attacks and projectiles like many other fighters, this is not a fighter. It's also a mini game inside of an RPG, but that's beside the point. Virtual On. A lot of people think Virtual On is a fighting game. So a lot of people look at a game like Virtual On and be like, oh man, the players are skilled. They're really into it. They're doing strategies. They're moving at high speeds. They're not hesitating. Yeah, you can do all that kind of stuff in any action game, or most action games, if you will. But the difference maker is, even though they're using a lot of projectiles and they're strategizing, one, there's not a lot of melee attacks, so that automatically sort of discounts this game. But if you look at the way that the projectiles are designed, you don't see a lot of mechanics, you don't see a lot of opportunities that come about when you perfectly predict your opponent, what they're going to do and when they're going to do it. It's pretty much just shoot projectiles and dodge around and try to just sort of get a feel for some kind of advantage that you press, but it's more loose than it is clear. And one of the coolest parts about fighting game is when you make a game designed around double-blind interplay, the interactions are clear. Like, I guessed right at that moment. There was an intense moment where both of us didn't know what was going to happen. I picked the right move. I blocked your dragon punch. I grabbed you when you block. I chose the right attack to stuff your attack. But in this game, the interactions are far less clear. I mean, that is kind of the nature of, over-the-shoulder camera, 3D games, and projectile-based games. But ultimately, the point I want to make here is that this is just an action game. And even though you can play action games competitively and do well with it, have fun, even develop communities and metagames, this is not fighting game gameplay. Kirby Fighter for DS. So I played this game a little bit on my 3DS, just single player stuff. It's called Kirby Fighters, but it is definitely not a fighter. It basically just lets you play your single player moves in a 4-player context. And you have a block, you have a shield, you have your jump, so you can get items kind of like Smash Brothers. But ultimately, the reason this isn't a fighter is because the moves are definitely not balanced for double-blind interplay. The moves are taken directly out of a single-player game. The moves are slow. Some moves just seem far more powerful and capable than the others, just like they were in the single-player. And there's not a lot of interplay between the moves either. So the move with the most range usually wins. The move that spams projectiles the best usually wins. And it's exactly why you can't go easily from a single player experience to a multiplayer experience. The balance and taking a move and making sure that on the very finite, minute level that it's balanced for multiplayer takes so much more effort than just making a game that's designed for single player. So, bye Kirby. All the Zelda multiplayer, they're not fighting games, even though you have a sword and you can run around. Not a fighting game. Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm. It's a competitive action brawler. It's not a fighting game, as far as what I can tell. Just like with Virtual On, I'll show you. A lot of this game is when you really start looking at how these players are playing, what's happening on the screen, and what kind of patterns you see in the flow of the action. Like, you don't need to know the frame data of the moves. You don't really even need to know how the game works in order to see the rhythm of the combat. And when the rhythm of the combat is a specific way, then you can kind of start reverse engineering why and understand that, oh, it's probably this way because they're trying to optimize in a situation where predicting your opponent doesn't get you the advantage. And if predicting your opponent doesn't get you the advantage, then it's not designed around double blind interplay, and therefore they have to maximize some other kind of advantage, which usually is overwhelming offense, just mix-ups in general. Like, they don't know where you're going to be, they don't know where to block, but and that can make the game look like a fighter, but ultimately they're just shuffling around and playing around in a very different kind of competitive environment. Right here you can see a lot of what you see in Marvel vs. Capcom, right? Using assist types, putting field effects into the area, like throwing bombs down on the ground, combos. You can even see combo breakers if you know what a Kararimi is, where they replace themselves with a log to get out of a combo. All that is here, and all those mechanics, all those systems are very similar to things we discussed, but the core is why we talked about the core. The core, the most important part is, are the moves that you're using, are they balanced around double blind? And the gameplay will go in one direction or another just based on that simple fact. And from what I've seen, this game isn't. So it's just pretty much a competitive brawler and not necessarily a fighter. I don't know too much about the Dragon Ball Z games, but I think they're a lot like the Naruto Ninja Storm games. Gang Beast is a game where you're pretty much playing jelly beans and running around throwing people. Wrestling style, definitely not a fighter. Hardly a game even. Swordy, not a fighter. From what I could tell, the last time I looked at Swordy was when it was still in development, so we can take that off the list. Dark Souls and Bloodborne PvP, not a fighting game. Just like with the Kirby fighter, taking single player moves and just putting two players against each other is not good enough. Real competitive games, real fighting games take so much more care and attention designed into every frame and every move on such a fine level that you are not going to get that kind of balance. You are not going to get that kind of gameplay from a single player experience. So, and also Dark Souls is an action RPG, so just like Final Fantasy Dissidia, good luck with all that wide design space that you're trying to manage and all of that RPG stats and all of that. Not gonna happen. Same reason you can look at action RPGs like Tales of Symphonia, and even though it looks kind of like Smash Brothers. Okay, so this is my favorite boss battle in the entire game. It's a Yan and Bota boss battle. This is fairly early in the game, so you don't have all your like super strong abilities, and it's a 4v2 for the most part. So you see these two swordsmen here, this guy here, and this guy with the blue hair here. These are the two enemies, the two bosses, and then you can fight these guys pretty much like a brawler action game. You got your swordsmen, you have combos, they have moves that break themselves out of combos, combo breakers. You have guard breaking moves. They have other techniques that kind of make the battle have a lot of interesting interplay in different scenarios. And as long as you're not overpowering your opponent like this guy is, it looks like a pretty interesting fight, but ultimately it's not a fighting game, right? You can do a lot with action games, you can do a lot with brawlers, you can do a lot with those two genres and mixing it up, but not only is this a single player game, which kind of disqualifies it from our criteria, but these moves are definitely not designed around double blind interplay. And I haven't played an action RPG that is, because it's hard. Nobody would do it unless they really knew exactly the kind of gameplay experience they wanted to go for and exactly how much work it takes. Punch Out, not a fighting game. Even though you're using melee moves, I don't think the hitboxes in this game are well articulated. It's pretty much a very discrete, very set in stone interactions with your punches. And I've even seen the multiplayer in Punch Out 2. And it looks like you have a few dodges and a few things that you can do, but it's ultimately much more like a WarioWare micro game than it is a fighting game. And the reason why we say you need continuous space in a fighting game is because every inch matters, every frame matters, and negotiating those differences matters. So if you stick two players in front of each other, I'll show you. I gotta show you everything, why not? Okay, right here. So as you can see, like, they have set punches, overhead, side dodge, straight punch, not a lot of variety in the moves, but like with the senior footsies or dive kick or monkey ball, fight 2, you don't need a lot of variety of moves in order to get the fighting game gameplay to happen. However, you do need to be able to control, when you use your moves, and kind of also importantly where you use your moves. And because you can't control your little max in this game, you're just kind of stuck. You're kind of stuck there playing a very simple sort of rock, paper, scissors-y, Simon Says-y type of game. And for that reason, and the fact that even though these moves are designed around double blind, like you can see if you dodge at the same time they punch, actually it looks like you can react to most things except for a jab. Yeah, so it's designed around double blind to be a more interesting action game, but it's definitely not good enough to be a fighter. That continuous space thing matters. And otherwise you're going to have a game that's too simple and too minigame-like. Samurai Gun, not a fighting game. The core mechanics, especially the sword strikes, are not designed around double blind. You can stalemate in that game pretty easily. So it's kind of like what you saw in Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm. You're supposed to move around a lot to overwhelm your opponent, but when it gets down to it and you're really facing off against your opponent at a close quarters, there's not a lot to the gameplay. Power Stone definitely doesn't have attacks that are I think well articulated as far as punches and kicks go. They're pretty generous with their hitboxes, and even though they give you the freedom to move, I don't think even the majority of the gameplay is about punching and kicking. It's about throwing objects around and getting the power stones and powering up and overwhelming your opponent. A lot of what we saw in Ninja Storm. So Power Stone is definitely not a fighting game. I haven't seen any of the same kind of fighting game patterns and strategies emerge from gameplay. Even though it's an old game, I don't even think people take it that seriously. That's just where it stands. Towerfall, not a fighting game. You shoot arrows and you move around. You have arrow hitboxes, which are projectiles, but you have no melee attacks. And even though the arrows are somewhat designed around double blind, for a few small cases, for the most part, it's just an action game. A multiplayer arena side-scrolling action game and not a fighting game. And Lethal League is a really interesting case. We can address that some other time. But what you do in Lethal League is very indirect. So in this game, you hit a ball, and then the only thing that can hurt your opponent is the ball. And when you hit it, it kind of goes under your color so that you can't get hurt by it. But your opponent tries to sneak in tiny little opportunities to take control of the ball and hit it back at you. And it has parries, and it has interesting double blind like tuning for a lot of its mechanics, but a lot of what you do is indirect. So I could hardly say that this game you have articulated attack and hitboxes, because you're mostly hitting a ball around. Well, this is super intense, golly. You're mostly hitting a ball around and trying to mix up your opponent, kind of like what we saw in Naruto Ninja Storm. And you're not even directly having to think about or deal with your opponent's attacks. You're pretty much just thinking about them in a sort of a chain reaction, like when do I get my opportunity to hit after my opponent does XYZ with the ball. And you can see too, your spacing is also indirect. Like it doesn't really matter how close you stand to your opponent. It only matters when the ball is deadly. And for those reasons, I think this game is a really interesting, really great action game, but not necessarily a fighter, even though you can play it highly competitively and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, by looking at the mechanics, we can see that games like Needhog and Super Monkey Ball 2, Monkey Fight 2, they are fighters, even though they don't look like fighters. And then by using the criteria, we can look at games that look like they could be fighters, but understand that they don't meet the criteria on one of those 4 levels. Usually it's either level 2 or level 4. And even though fighters can borrow systems and subsystems from other games and other genres, it's also possible for other genres to borrow tunings and mechanics and systems from fighters. I think the swords design in Halo 3 is very much like a fighter, kind of like senior footsies. You have a lunge, you have a quick move, and you have those things put together creates a really interesting combination of melee attacking hitboxes that are articulated that allow you to engage in double blind interplay. So definitely the swords in Halo very much are like fighting game gameplay. And as long as nobody else is shooting you in the back or you're not getting ganged up on from afar, engaging with swords in Halo you can transfer all your fighting skills over, and it's really interesting. And on a side note, Kid Icarus Uprising, the melee and ranged attacks are all designed around double blind interplay. from the continuous shots, the continuous charge shots, and the charge shots, from dashing through a projectile and parrying it by shooting just after that small timing window, the looper rounds for the melee attacks, all of that, super detailed. I mean, it's no wonder Masahiro Sakurai created Smash Brothers. He also created this game, so he's definitely taking what he has learned making a fighting game and applying it to other genres, and that's why Kid Icarus Uprising is my favorite shooter and one of my favorite action games of all time. So you can find out more about that. I'll put a link down in the description. I did a long triple video series and a long review just breaking down all the systems in Kid Icarus. So if you want to know more about that, you can check out that video. But essentially, that is what I want to say about fighting games. So I'll go back over here. So that was a really long look at a whole bunch of fighting games, looking at them in detail and understanding how to apply the criteria to understand what kind of gameplay they specialize in, how you play them, how that affects players, how that affects people wanting to dig deeper into their systems. The 4 criteria is elegant. It applies to all these different cases and really helps us understand how they compare and stack up against each other. So I hope you've learned something. We have a lot more topics I want to discuss about fighting games, like actually how to understand an individual fighting game instead of looking at a whole bunch of different ones in comparison. So I will see you definitely next time on Design Over Time. My name's Kirby Kid. You can follow us at Design Over Time on Twitter, or you can follow at Serving Smash for just the Smash Brothers components, or you can follow me at Kirby Kid. But until next time, peace.